They weren't the strongest, they weren't always the most numerous, but somehow they took over vast continents, ruled millions of people, and left a legacy that still shapes the world today. What made the colonizers so clever? This isn't a story of guns and ships alone. It's a story of strategy, psychology, economics, and power that went deeper than anyone imagined. In the next hour, we're going to pull back the curtain and reveal exactly how colonizers built an empire of control that lasted long after they left. This is the hidden story of colonial cleverness. And ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a question. How did a handful of European powers, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, manage to dominate and control vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, often ruling over millions of people with only a few thousand soldiers and administrators? The answer is not just superior technology, not just violence. The deeper answer is this: the colonizers were clever. Clever in the way they fought, clever in the way they ruled, clever in the way they structured economies, laws, and even minds. When we think of colonialism, we often imagine war, conquest, and brutality. And yes, that was part of it. But what kept colonial empires alive for centuries was not only brute force, it was strategy, it was manipulation, it was psychology. In this talk, I will take you on a journey through 5 dimensions of colonial cleverness: military, political, economic, cultural, and psychological, legal, and structural. By the end, I hope you'll see colonialism not just as domination, but as a very deliberate, very cunning project of control. Please stay with me. This journey into colonial cleverness matters, and I promise it will open your eyes. If you find value in this, kindly like, share, comment, subscribe, and support me so I can keep making more content like this. Thank you for being here with me. Military cleverness. Let's begin with the battlefield. When Europeans first encountered the great civilizations of Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they often faced armies far larger than their own. Yet, time and again, they emerged victorious. How? First, superior weaponry. Firearms, cannons, and naval artillery gave European armies an edge. Consider Hernán Cortés in Mexico, with only a few hundred Spaniards, but armed with steel swords, crossbows, and horses, things the Aztecs had never seen. He managed to topple an empire of millions. But technology alone does not explain everything. The real cleverness was in divide and rule tactics. Take the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The British East India Company faced the Nawab of Bengal's army, nearly 50,000 men. The British? Barely 3,000. On paper, they had no chance. Yet Robert Clive, the British commander, bribed key generals in the Nawab's army to betray him. When the battle began, large portions of the Nawab's forces simply stood aside. Victory was not won through strength, but through cunning manipulation. That single battle marked the beginning of British dominance in India. Another layer of military cleverness was psychological warfare. Colonizers often staged violent massacres not just to kill, but to intimidate. A single lesson could keep a population fearful for years. The British in Kenya during the Mau Mau Rebellion, or the French in Algeria, used collective punishment, burning villages, executing leaders to instill terror. And finally, let's not forget the role of alliances. Colonizers were rarely alone. They partnered with local groups who had rivalries with others. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs would have been impossible without alliances with tribes who hated Aztec domination. Similarly, in Africa, the British would recruit Askaris, local soldiers, to fight against their own people. So yes, colonizers had guns and cannons, but their military cleverness was deeper. They knew when to bribe, when to divide, when to terrify, and when to recruit allies. That combination allowed a few thousand men to rule millions. Political cleverness. Once the colonizers secured military footholds, their next clever move was politics. You see, colonial rule was never just about fighting battles. It was about controlling people without always fighting them. And for that, politics was their sharpest weapon. Divide and rule, one of the most effective political strategies, was to exploit existing divisions, tribal rivalries, ethnic differences, or dynastic disputes. The British were masters of this. In India, they didn't conquer the entire subcontinent all at once. Instead, they signed treaties with some princes, fought others, and constantly played rival states against each other. If one ruler resisted, his neighbor might be promised rewards for supporting the British. This was repeated across Africa. In Nigeria, for example, the British took advantage of long-standing rivalries between the House of Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbo in the east. By keeping these groups suspicious of each other, colonial rulers made it harder for unified resistance to emerge. Puppet rulers and indirect rule. Another clever move was the creation of puppet governments. Colonizers often allowed local rulers to remain in place, kings, chiefs, or princes, but stripped them of real power. This was called indirect rule. The British used it extensively in Africa. Instead of sending thousands of administrators, they kept local chiefs as figureheads. These chiefs collected quasi-sticbas and enforced laws, but always under British supervision. To the people, it looked like their leaders were still in charge, but in reality, they were just extensions of colonial power. The French, in contrast, preferred direct rule, placing French officials in charge and trying to assimilate colonies into French civilization. Both methods had the same outcome. Local autonomy disappeared, but resistance looked riskier because it often meant going against one's own chief or ruler. Treaties and trickery. Colonizers were also clever with treaties. Many were signed with vague or misleading language, often mistranslated into local languages. Chiefs believed they were agreeing to friendship or trade, while the Europeans understood it as a transfer of sovereignty. The 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference is the ultimate example of political cunning. European powers gathered in Berlin to divide up Africa among themselves, with rulers from Africa not even invited. Borders were drawn with straight lines on maps, cutting across communities and kingdoms, with no regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities. That's why today, many African countries still struggle with artificial borders that were born from colonial cleverness. Co-opting elites. Another trick, colonizers often co-opted local elites. They gave titles, wealth, or positions of prestige to certain individuals who then acted as middlemen. This created a small class that benefited from colonialism and had every reason to maintain the system. For example, in French West Africa, the policy of assimilation allowed some Africans to become French citizens, but only a tiny elite. These evalués were educated, loyal to France, and used to maintain control over the majority. Political cunning and action. Let's go back to India for a moment. After the British crushed the revolt of 1857, they realized that open confrontation with local rulers was costly, so they shifted tactics. Instead of abolishing all princely states, they kept them, but ensured these rulers were dependent on British protection. Over 560 princely states existed, but none could act independently. It was a masterstroke of political manipulation. Rulers retained palaces, titles, and prestige, but real power sat with the British Governor-General. So what made colonial politics clever? It was not about erasing old systems overnight. It was about bending them, twisting them, and reshaping them to serve colonial interests. Colonizers understood that people obey traditions and leaders, so they made those leaders instruments of colonial control. In the end, colonial political strategy boiled down to one principle: divide, deceive, and dominate without appearing to rule directly. Economic cleverness. If military and political cleverness helped colonizers gain power, economic cleverness helped them keep it and profit from it. Colonialism was never charity. At its core, it was a vast business enterprise. But what's striking is how cleverly the colonizers set up systems that drained wealth from colonies while making those very colonies dependent on them. Control of resources. The first step was simple: seize control of the most valuable resources. The Spanish in Latin America targeted gold and silver. They built the great mining centers of Potosi in present-day Bolivia, extracting mountains of silver using forced indigenous and African labor. The British in India focused on cotton, tea, and indigo. Later, they took control of jute, opium, and other cash crops. The Belgians in the Congo exploited rubber, using brutal forced labor that cost millions of lives. In each case, the colonizers identified what was most profitable globally and monopolized it. Taxes that forced labor. But they didn't just grab resources, they also engineered systems that forced people into labor. One common method was taxation in colonial currency. Imagine you are a farmer in Africa in the late 19th century. You live off your land, trade locally, and have no use for European money. Suddenly, the colonial government imposes a hut tax or a head tax. And here's the catch. You can only pay it in European currency. How do you get that currency? By working on plantations, in mines, or for colonial infrastructure. In short, taxation became a clever tool to push people into the very economic system that benefited colonizers, destroying local industries. Another strategy was deindustrialization. Colonizers didn't just extract raw materials, they also destroyed local industries that competed with European ones. The classic example is India. Before British rule, India was a major producer of fine textiles. Indian cotton and silk were famous across the world. But when the British gained control, they flooded India with cheap, machine-made textiles from Manchester and Lancashire. At the same time, they placed heavy taxes on Indian-made cloth. The result? The Indian textile industry collapsed, and millions of weavers were impoverished. This wasn't an accident, it was deliberate economic cleverness. Colonies were turned into suppliers of raw materials and buyers of European finished goods. Monopolies and trade restrictions. Colonizers also imposed monopolies. The Portuguese, for instance, forced Asian spice traders to buy cartaz passes, permits to sail, without which their ships could be seized. The British East India Company held a monopoly on trade in tea, salt, and opium, and trade restrictions were cleverly designed to favor the colonizer. Colonies could not freely trade with other nations. They had to send exports to the mother country first. This mercantile system ensured that wealth always flowed in one direction, toward Europe. The opium trade, a masterstroke of exploitation. Perhaps the most striking example of economic cunning is the Opium Wars. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, Britain faced a problem. It wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China didn't want British goods. Trade was unbalanced. The British solution? Sell opium, grown in India, to China. By addicting millions, they created a profitable market. When the Chinese emperor tried to ban opium, the British waged war, defeating China and forcing it to accept the drug trade through unequal treaties. This was not only economic exploitation, it was economic warfare disguised as trade. Infrastructure that served the colonizer. Colonizers also built railways, ports, and roads. But notice this, they were not designed to benefit the local people. They were designed to move raw materials from mines and plantations to ports for export. Take the railways in Africa and India. They rarely connected villages to each other. Instead, they connected resource-rich areas to coastal ports. The infrastructure looked modern and impressive, but its purpose was extractive, not developmental. Economic cleverness in summary. So how clever were the colonizers? They taxed people into labor. They killed off local industries. They forced colonies into one-way trade systems. They built infrastructure that served themselves. It was a trap. Colonies were made dependent on Europe for manufactured goods, while their economies were reshaped and around supplying raw materials. And the legacy of that economic cleverness? Even today, many former colonies still rely heavily on exporting raw materials, coffee, cocoa, oil, minerals, while importing finished goods from wealthier nations. The pattern set centuries ago continues. Great. Now we reach the heart of it. Part 4. Cultural and Psychological Cleverness. This is where colonizers showed some of their most subtle and long-lasting strategies. Cultural and psychological cleverness. Military victories could win land. Political trickery could win rulers. Economic systems could win wealth. But colonizers knew something deeper. To truly dominate, you must shape how people think. And this is where cultural and psychological cleverness came in. Language as a weapon. One of the most powerful tools was language. Colonizers imposed their own languages. English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, often at the expense of local tongues. Why was this clever? Because language is not just words. It is identity, culture, and worldview. By teaching colonized peoples in the colonizers' language, they ensured that generations grew up thinking, speaking, and even dreaming in the tongue of their rulers. Today, think about it. Across Africa, people from Nigeria to Senegal to Kenya communicate in English or French. Across Latin America, Spanish and Portuguese dominate. The linguistic map of the world is one of colonial cleverness. Education and the shaping of minds. Even more powerful was education. The British in India debated what kind of education to give to Indians. In 1835, Thomas Macaulay wrote his famous Minute on Indian Education, where he argued that the goal was to create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. And that's exactly what they did. They trained a small elite, clerks, lawyers, teachers, who would serve colonial administration. So while colonizers spoke of the rule of law, in reality it was law as domination. The illusion of justice. Another clever trick was that colonial law was presented as modern and civilized. It often came with new courts, judges in robes, and written codes. To many locals, this looked advanced compared to customary systems of oral tradition. But the catch was this: the courts were always tilted in favor of Europeans. A dispute between a European and an African, the European usually won. Land contested between a settler and a community, the settler usually kept it. By cloaking inequality in the language of law, colonizers made exploitation look legitimate. Divide and rule in law. Laws were also used to divide populations. In India, the British categorized people by religion, and ethnicity in censuses and legal systems. Over time, this hardened identities that had once been more fluid, laying the groundwork for later conflicts. In Rwanda, Belgian colonial law identified people as Hutu or Tutsi, issuing identity cards that locked people into categories. Decades later, those divisions fueled one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. This was clever in a dark way. Use the law not just to govern, but to fracture societies in ways that kept them weak and divided. Infrastructure of power. Colonial structures were not only legal, but also bureaucratic. Colonizers set up civil services, police forces, and administrative hierarchies that centralized power. These systems were designed to serve colonial interests, but they often remained in place after independence. That's why many post-colonial states still struggle with bureaucracies that feel more like colonial relics than indigenous systems of governance. The legacy of legal cleverness. The brilliance, if we can call it that, of colonial law and structures was that they lasted. Even after colonizers left, many independent nations kept the colonial languages, the colonial legal codes, the colonial borders, and the colonial bureaucracies. In some cases, people didn't have much choice. These were the only systems in place. But the point is, the colonizers had designed them so well, so thoroughly, that they became the framework for the future. So what made this clever? It wasn't just about laws. It was about creating systems that looked modern, sounded fair, but in reality entrenched inequality and control. Systems so deeply rooted that even after colonial flags came down, their influence lived on. In other words, colonial cleverness turned temporary conquest into long-term legacy. The lasting cleverness of colonizers. We've traveled through the layers of colonial cunning, military cleverness, winning land with strategy, surprise, and superior arms. Political cleverness, dividing rivals, creating puppet rulers, and rewriting power. Economic cleverness, controlling resources, creating dependency, and shaping trade. Cultural and psychological cleverness, shaping minds, rewriting history, and controlling identity. Legal and structural cleverness, designing laws and institutions that lasted long after colonial rule ended. What emerges is a clear truth. Colonial domination was not just brute force. It was a deeply thought-out system, a multi-layered web designed to control, exploit, and reshape societies for the benefit of the colonizer. The cleverness wasn't in conquering lands. The cleverness was in creating systems that could endure, even after independence. The legacy today. Even now, the legacies of this cleverness remain. Borders drawn at the Berlin Conference still define Africa. Languages imposed centuries ago still dominate education. Economies built to export raw materials still shape trade. Legal systems born under colonialism still govern nations. And cultural ideas planted long ago still influence how people think about themselves and the world. Colonial cleverness was not erased with the departure of the colonizers. It became part of the structure of modern life. That is why understanding colonial history is not just about the past. It is about understanding the challenges of today. The story of colonial cleverness is a reminder of the power of strategy, but also of responsibility. Cleverness can build, but it can also dominate. And it shows how ideas, systems, and culture can be as powerful as armies in shaping the world. The challenge now is to learn from this history, to recognize the structures and legacies still in place, and to ask how they can be changed. Colonialism was clever, but history is a conversation, and now it's ours to continue. Colonialism wasn't just a chapter in history, it was a masterclass in control. And the cleverness of the colonizers didn't end with independence. It left a world shaped by their strategies in politics, economies, laws, culture, and even our minds. Understanding this history isn't about blame, it's about awareness. Because the smartest empires weren't just built on power. They were built on ideas, systems, and structures that still live among us today. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I sincerely appreciate your time and attention. Your engagement is truly valued, and it is an honor to share this exploration with you. If you found this meaningful, please consider subscribing and supporting me so we can continue exploring topics like this together.